Life had been comfortable for Michael. His home, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, was a sanctuary filled with laughter, warmth, and a hum of family life. As the breadwinner, Michael prided himself on providing everything his wife, Anaya, and their two children needed luxuries they'd grown accustomed to, from private schooling to vacations in exotic destinations. Their world seemed perfect, or so it appeared. But behind the polished exterior, something had shifted. Over the years, Anaya's relationship with her estranged father had deepened. What began as an occasional phone call turned into frequent visits, and soon he became a larger presence in their lives. Michael, while supportive of Anaya reconnecting with her father, began to notice the subtle change. Anaya's once warm affection began to fade, replaced by a growing emotional bond with her real dad. It was only when Anaya came to him one cold, crisp evening with a trembling voice, revealing that she wanted separation, that Michael understood the true depth of the change. "He's here, Michael, and he's been everything I've needed," she confessed. "I think the children should spend more time with him." The word stung. Anaya had replaced him not just emotionally, but now physically. The life Michael had worked so hard to build was crumbling. The family he had cherished was slipping through his fingers. Michael's world felt as though it had been turned upside down. The weight of the separation didn't just affect his heart, it rippled through every corner of his life. His role as a provider, the man who had always ensured his family wanted for nothing, no longer seemed to matter. With Anaya's decision to turn her father and pull away from him emotionally, Michael was left in a disorienting void. The once bustling house now felt cold and silent. Where there had been laughter over dinner, there was now an eerie quiet. The children, although still in his care, were divided, torn between their mother's new life and the comforts Michael had always provided. They still lived in the same house, yet everything had changed. His wealth, the very thing that had kept their lives flowing smoothly, now fell hollow. Michael's money, once a symbol of security and success, had become a reminder of everything slipping away. Without Anaya by his side, there was a stark realization that all those years of building an ideal life had been rooted in his financial stability. He wasn't just the emotional anchor, he was the bedrock. And now, that foundation had crumbled. The more Michael thought about it, the more his anger and hurt grew. Anaya had always valued the lifestyle he provided, but now, she seemed to have replaced him with someone who didn't offer the same material comforts her father, a man who had no interest in sharing the same wealth. Michael began to question everything. Was he truly valued for who he was, or just for what he could give? And as the days passed, his answer became clear. Without the money, he was no longer needed. In the wake of Anaya's decision, Michael felt an overwhelming need to take control, to assert some power in a situation where he felt helpless and betrayed. The sting of being replaced by her real dad, someone who hadn't provided for her, hadn't supported her through the years, felt like an insult he couldn't ignore. She had chosen him, and now, Michael would make her realize just how much she had taken for granted. If Anaya wanted to live without him, she would see what life was like without the security he provided. So, Michael began to pull back slowly at first, then more decisively. He stopped paying for the private schooling he had once insisted on, the tuition fees that had opened doors to opportunities they had grown used to. He scaled back the family vacations, no more luxurious trips to exotic destinations. He even began tightening the purse strings on everyday expenses, leaving Anaya and the children to manage on their own. At first, Anaya didn't react. She thought Michael's withdrawal was temporary, just a moment of frustration. But as the weeks passed, the consequences became impossible to ignore. The children began to feel the pinch. Their clothes, once new and branded, started showing wear. They couldn't understand why they weren't going on the usual family vacations, why their mother was so stressed, why their father had become so distant. Michael could see the confusion and hurt in their eyes, but he also felt a sense of satisfaction. This, he thought, was a reality check. They would learn to appreciate what they had, what he had given them when it was no longer available. But as the months wore on, the emotional toll became more apparent. Anaya, too, began to feel the strain. The lifestyle she had enjoyed was slipping away, and her father, her new source of emotional support, didn't have the means to step in and help. He had no intention of covering the financial gaps Michael had once filled. Slowly, Anaya's own resentment began to surface. She'd never realized just how much of their life had depended on Michael's wealth until it was no longer there. Michael's withdrawal had shifted the dynamics of their family, but it hadn't come without consequences. What had started as a form of retaliation was beginning to crack open a deeper, more painful realization, one that he had not anticipated. The lives they had built were fragile, and wealth, though powerful, was not the only force holding them together. The consequences were becoming clear not just for Anaya, but for the children, too. Michael's financial pull might have kept the family in comfort, but it had also been an invisible thread that had kept them all tied to a way of life that no longer felt sustainable. As the children became more aware of the situation, the walls between Michael and them started to grow. He had started to teach them a lesson in independence. But the lesson was proving to be far more complex than he had anticipated. As the weeks passed, Michael began to feel the weight of his decisions more acutely. The initial sense of empowerment of asserting control over his life started to fade, replaced by a gnawing feeling of guilt. The children, once vibrant and carefree, had become withdrawn. Their joy had diminished as they adjusted to a life without the privileges they once took for granted. The once gleaming house, full of laughter, now felt quiet, even cold. Michael hadn't anticipated how deeply his withdrawal would affect them. They no longer asked for the things they once expected. They stopped asking for new clothes, the latest gadgets, and trips abroad. Instead, they spent more time indoors, their faces clouded with confusion. His children, especially his eldest Emma, began to act out, their frustration bubbling over. The smile that once graced her face was now rare, replaced by an expression of quiet disappointment. They were learning to live with less, but it was costing them their childhood joy. The impact on Anaya was equally profound. The financial strain was palpable. The lifestyle she had clung to now seemed distant and hollow, and her own discomfort was no longer hidden. She had once seen Michael as a provider, the one who would ensure a life of ease, but now that security was gone, and there was no one to fill the gap. Her father, emotionally supportive though he may have been, had no interest in stepping into the role of financier. Michael watched all of this unfold, and the weight of his decisions settled heavily on him. He had wanted them to understand the consequences of their choices, but now he was starting to realize the cost. His desire for revenge, for control, had hurt the very people he cared about the most. What had he hoped to achieve? To prove that he was irreplaceable? Or to break them down to the point where they would beg for him back? In the quiet of the evening, as he watched Emma stare out the window, lost in thought, Michael's heart softened. The truth was undeniable. He had gone too far. And now, he wasn't just losing his family. He was losing himself. The lesson he thought he was teaching them was slowly becoming the lesson he needed to learn. One evening, as the house settled into its usual silence, Michael decided to take a step he hadn't planned on. The weight of his guilt had finally become too much to bear. He knew he had to make things right not just for Anaya and the children, but for himself. He couldn't keep punishing them. Not when he had learned the hard way that money, while powerful, wasn't the glue that held a family together. Michael reached out to Anaya. They sat together, awkwardly at first, both uncertain of where to start. But in that moment of raw honesty, the walls between them began to crumble. He admitted that his actions had been fueled by bitterness and hurt, but he was willing to work through it for the sake of their children and their future. Anaya, too, confessed that she hadn't realized the true cost of her decision to turn away from him. She had sought comfort, but now she understood that comfort wasn't what had kept their family strong. Together, they decided to rebuild not on the foundation of money, but on mutual respect and emotional connection. Their children, though scarred by the change, would learn to adapt. The lesson wasn't material wealth, but in the value of resilience, love, and the courage to rebuild from the ground up. They may never return to what they once had, but they would have something far more lasting: understanding. Months passed, and the transformation was slow but undeniable. Michael, Anaya, and their children found themselves on a new path, one that was harder, yes, but also more meaningful. The house was still the same, but the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't the lavish comforts they once knew, but there was a newfound warmth, a sense of togetherness that money could never buy. Michael had learned that his wealth, while a tool, had never been the foundation of his family's happiness. It was a connection between them to love, the small acts of care that truly mattered. Anaya, too, had come to realize that her father's emotional support couldn't replace the stability and trust that Michael had once provided. Their children, though still adjusting, began to appreciate the strength that came from facing challenges as a family. They didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead would still have its struggles. But Michael felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The lesson, though painful, had been necessary. Family wasn't about what you had, but who you had and the effort you put into keeping them close. As they sat together at the dinner table, a quiet understanding passed between them. The storm had passed, and they had weathered it stronger for the struggle.